I'm John. The views I'm about to share are my own. They're not the views of my employer, a consulting firm called CEB, or of First Bank and Trust in Brookings, or Fishback Financial, where I'm a board member. And the research I'm about to share today is work that I did, not that any of those organizations did. Now, I happen to think that the work those organizations do and their views are pretty good, but this is not those. This is my views. My talk has a serious sounding name. It's called What Economists Call a Moral Hazard, and it comes, as I said, for some research I did in graduate school. But the talk's going to use that research to try and tie in a few other things that aren't like the research at all, and then I'm going to try and take that and turn it into a conversation about how we might reimagine our rural community. Let me show you a couple of things. This is a coffee shop. And then this one is a building to live in. It's a rental in Massachusetts, actually. And this is Brookings High School here in town. So this talk is going to try and take that very serious sounding name with that odd term, moral hazard, in it, and tie that together with all of these things, and then somehow tie that into reinventing rural. So wish me luck. When I started thinking about moral hazard, all I really knew about it was that when I heard that idea, moral hazard, mentioned, it was always used as a rhetorical tool, arguing that there was economic proof that a particular policy should, and actually far more frequently should not, be adopted. All of which must leave you thinking, well, okay, what does it mean already? And if you're like I was, you suspect you already know what it means. You think it means some sort of threat to character. You think it means temptation. And you're not entirely wrong. Some people use moral hazard to mean a threat to character, and way back in the term's history, it actually did have something to do with character. Moral hazard comes to us from insurance, old-time insurers, and I mean really old-time, like the 13 and 1400s, wanted to make sure that they weren't going to provide some shady character with an insurance policy who would then do something wrong and stick them with the tap. If you have seen one of those episodes of The Simpsons where Moe talks about burning down the bar to collect the insurance, that you know exactly what I mean here. Over time, however, the idea that moral hazard has anything to do with character has actually fallen aside. In 1963, an economist imported the idea of moral hazard from insurance into economics. And the way economists use the idea of moral hazard now dominates how the rest of us use it. Which means that the image that you should keep in mind when you hear the term moral hazard is not the serpent in the garden. It's a seatbelt sign. Moral hazard has come to mean that when you feel protected from a risk, you are far more likely to take that risk. So the idea here is that if someone forces you to wear a seatbelt in a car, you'll drive more recklessly because you feel protected from the consequences of an accident. And that thinking has been applied to a lot of different subjects. Moral hazard applies to healthcare. If you have health insurance and don't have to pay the full cost of health coverage for expensive tests, you're far more likely to order those tests. And others have taken the idea further, suggesting that because America doesn't have a draft, and therefore it's unlikely that the children of wealthy elite policymakers serve in the military, that somehow they feel protected from the consequences of wars and are more likely to start them. And moral hazard has even been used to argue that because we provide a welfare system, that people therefore choose to be poor or sick or old. My research tried to track not just how often the phrase moral hazard has been used, but how it has been spread. I looked at the use of the term across a sample of 1,000 different articles in academic policy journals, in then public policy journals and white papers, and then in the popular press. Moral hazard was introduced into the modern economic literature by a man named Kenneth Arrow. Kenneth Arrow later won the Nobel Prize. From economics, it spread into policy papers with figures like George Gilder. Remember George Gilder? Beginning to say things like, the moral hazard of current programs are clear. Unemployment programs cause unemployment. And then the term exploded in the popular press where public opinion is formed. The term was applied to debt forgiveness, it was applied to AIDS policy, to welfare, to the draft. What particularly caught my attention was driving from Washington, D.C., where I'd lived for 10 years, to New York, where I did this research. At about 4 p.m. on the day I was driving the levees around New Orleans broke. And moral hazard was frequently used in the conversation around rebuilding New Orleans, with some people arguing that if we did rebuild New Orleans, not only would we likely see further human misery in New Orleans, but somehow Californians would be encouraged to build homes on the San Andreas Fault because they would feel protected from the consequences of natural disaster. And increasingly, when people use the term over time, they used the term moral hazard in a phrase, and the phrase is what economists call a moral hazard. The article would say, and that creates what economists call a moral hazard. More than 18% of all the articles using the term after 1985 included that exact phrase. In rhetoric, that's called an appeal to authority. When someone uses the phrase what economists call a moral hazard, what they want you to believe is that an economist has studied their idea and agrees with them. So there's two reasons to care about this. The first is about who is responsible for our choices. And that really comes from how we started thinking about what moral hazard means when it was imported from economics. I want to tell you that story because it's a fascinating one. The first time moral hazard appeared in the economic literature was, as I said, Arrow's 1963 American Economic Review article about rising medical care costs. This is just the citation, and I'm going to map the articles that cited this article over time. What's interesting is that actually for several years, nothing much happened. But then in 1968, a freshly minted PhD named Mark Pauly responded to the letters section of that same journal that moral hazard isn't about morality at all, that demanding more of something when it doesn't cost you anything is, quote, not a result of moral perfidy, but of rational economic behavior. Arrow also wrote a letter back to the same journal that appeared in the letters to the editor. Remember what it was like before email? They wrote letters back and forth to a journal. And he wrote back, quote, Pauly's wording suggests that rational economic behavior and moral perfidy are mutually exclusive categories. No doubt Judas Iscariot turned a tidy profit from one of his transactions. But the usual judgment of his behavior is not necessarily wrong. The thing you need to know about this argument is that Arrow lost, that Pauly won. And as a result, moral hazard now refers not to the moral quality of individual action, but to the economic incentives that a situation presents. Let me say that again. Arrow put responsibility for doing the right thing on the individual. When he used the term moral hazard, he meant a person and their individual actions. Pauly assigned responsibility to the situation. The situation itself is the moral hazard. Pauly won. Articles published after 1968 cited both Arrow and Pauly. They refer to both articles, but they used Pauly's definition of the term. They refer to the moral hazard as the situation created when there is an incentive to do what might not be best, or even when there's just an ability to avoid consequences from doing the wrong thing. Pardon. Arrow lost. Pauly won. And again, that means that when you hear someone talk about moral hazard, they're talking about a set of circumstances, a set of incentives. And they are assuming that anyone put in that exact situation will behave exactly the same way. No matter who they are, they will react in the same way. I want to leave that for a moment, because that is what's going to tie us back to our community. The second reason to care about moral hazard actually goes to when we should and shouldn't rely on economics to help us make decisions. Look, I am a tie-wearing management consultant. I spend my days advising clients to rely on what analysis of numbers tells us about their situations. And I wear a tie while I do it. I'm a big believer that understanding the economics of any choice, of every choice, is almost always the right move. Doing that work to understand decisions in that way is almost always worth it. But you have to do the work. So when someone says or writes, well, that creates what economists call a moral hazard, I am immediately suspicious. I start listening to see whether they have actually done the work to prove their point or not. And you should listen closely, too. Because moral hazard in economic analysis in general, actually, can be used to support contradictory positions. Is there a moral hazard that policymakers will start wars if their sons and daughters don't serve in the military? Or is there a moral hazard in not starting a war with a nation that asserts its ability to build nuclear weapons? Is there a moral hazard in regulating hedge funds such that investors feel protected from the choice of a poor fund? Or is there a moral hazard from allowing hedge fund managers to operate without fear of censure if they abuse their clients' trust? In my view, it's just too glib to assert that policymakers' only concern when they make a war is whether their children might die, or that we should not require safety regulations like seatbelts that demonstrably reduce harm because of some theoretical incentive to recklessness. If the mere presence of moral hazard was actually an argument against action, no insurance policy could ever be written or sold, ever. And no government policy at all could ever be put into effect. So those who forcibly conscript economic thought into the service of their argument by using the thin gruel of what economists call a moral hazard, rather than doing the difficult work of economic analysis, claim a level of support for their position that just doesn't exist. They are suggesting to decision makers that the public is protected from the risk of a bad decision because experts have evaluated possible outcomes, even those experts have not. So in short, they're using economic language to portray decisions as protected from risk, and in doing so, they're encouraging bad behavior. That should by now sound a little bit familiar. Okay, so what does that mean for us as we imagine how our rural communities might develop? You'll recall a couple of minutes ago I got all fired up about Mark Pauly and his understanding of moral hazard, that it puts the responsibility on the situation rather than on the person. Again, he almost suggests that our own ability to choose, that what we might want is less important than the situation we find ourselves in. That's not going to make for good communities. And here's the thing. It's not true. People choose to make choices that create the communities they want at the expense of their own economic incentives all the time. This is a coffee shop. Someone made this. Whoever opened this coffee shop, which happens to be in Canada, got great support because this company has worked really hard to make it really easy to open these coffee shops. Everywhere you go, there's one of these. The coffee is always the same. The pastries are always the same and not to my taste. The music is always the same. And sometimes that's really comforting. But most of the time it's not. You can go into any of these shops anywhere and not know whether you're in Boise or Bedford Falls. But when you go into Cottonwood Coffee, you know you're in Brookings, South Dakota. Jacob didn't rely on somebody else's idea of what a coffee shop should be. It would have been easier to get the help that a big chain would have given him. It might have been easier to open a franchise. Certainly, he could have gotten a loan more easily. He could have gotten his supplies more cheaply from a central headquarters. But he didn't. He made a choice to work harder in order to give his community, to give us, something that feels like ours. This Massachusetts rental is the way it is because someone keeps it this way, on the edge of falling down, in need of paint. To be fair, they may do so, maintaining it cheaply because they're short of funds. They have to. Or they might be maximizing their profit. This is also a place to live. It's also a rental. When the owner of this house bought it, she actually was just buying the land it sat on. The house itself appraised as being worth nothing. But she liked it. She thought it had style, and she'd been friends with a prior owner. She spent a lot of time and effort putting it back on its feet. As I said, it's also a rental. 3 sets of tenants have lived there since she did the work to put it back together, including now Amanda and Will and I. This great little house is where my family and I live. My mom is our landlord. If she'd only cared about what the economics of the situation dictated, this house wouldn't be there. But because she liked this house and wants to live in a community that cares for existing buildings, uses them to their best impact, and makes them look beautiful, she did the work to put it back together. And because she did, we've gotten to celebrate 2 of my son's birthdays in it. This is Brookings High School, where the greatest debate coach in the history of South Dakota and possibly in American history, taught. Her name is Judy Kroll. She's in the National Hall of Fame for her field. During her time at Brookings, her teams did well. They went to regional tournaments and they won them. They went to national tournaments and very nearly won them several times. People around town know that. But what you might not know, what everyone in town might not know, unless you're tied to the field of teaching debate, is that there's this room at every debate tournament. I can't look over where Ms. Kroll is. There's this room at every debate tournament that's the command center. It's where the tournament is run. It's where the matchups are set. It's where the ballots are counted, called the tab room. And the coaches that run the tab room are the most talented, most trusted coaches that are available to the organizers of that tournament. What you probably don't know is that at the national tournament, where every coach in the country is available to the organizers of the tournament, Ms. Kroll helped run the tab room for more than a decade. And I'm telling you that because I want to invite you to speculate along with me. I don't know any of what I'm about to tell you, but I think it's true. During her time at the top of the field, all 3 of the big Sioux Falls schools replaced their debate coach. So did all kinds of schools in Minnesota and Nebraska. And to my point about her national prominence at the national tournament, so did almost all of what are called the national circuit teams. These are private schools around the country that fly business class to tournaments, all over the country every week for high school debate. I don't know this for certain, but I would be shocked if Ms. Kroll wasn't offered every single one of those jobs. From Sioux Falls down to St. Mark's Academy, down in Texas. Texas is not having a good day here, as we are talking about things. I would guess all of those jobs paid very, very well. It would have been economically rational for her to go coach there. But she didn't. She chose to teach in Brookings instead. She taught me how to make a speech. And I don't know if her doing so made her community into what she wanted it to be, but her doing so has helped me make my life into what I want it to be. So, here's Brookings. I centered the map on Nick's Hamburger Shop. I thought we could maybe agree that that was the physical, if not spiritual, center of town. I've chosen 3 examples that are close to me, clearly, and that have shaped my experience. But there are examples all over this great town of people choosing to try and build the kind of world they want to live in. And I should point out about all of the examples that I just gave that they weren't necessarily economically irrational. All of them hoped to be able to make a living after their choice. My point here is not that we should all be leaving money on the table all the time. My point is this. As the years go by, there are going to be choices this community faces towards which either our policymakers on the councils or advocates for one side or another will make arguments based on the community's economic interest. Those are important arguments, and we have to listen to them. But we shouldn't settle for arguments that fire off theory, like it'll raise the tax base because big box stores always do. Or, well, we can't do that because it'll create what economists call a moral hazard. Unless whoever makes those arguments is willing to show their work. Don't accept the theory unless they have the numbers to back it up. And we should also make our own choices. No matter what Mark Pauly says about the economics of a situation driving our choices, it is us and not our incentives that make our choices. If we want to live in a healthy rural community, then we need to make choices about how we want things to be, rather than seeing ourselves as at the mercy of larger forces. We are not a product of the forces acting on us. Our community is not nothing more than, but as much as the sum of all of our choices for it. Thank you.